mocked daily by her family for not having a husband, until a powerful mountain man chose her. A young woman named Cora endures the cruel mockery of her sisters in silence, marked by a fate that seems doomed to humiliation. A false letter, a parlor full of laughter, and her own mother's indifference push her toward the garden shed, where her tears fall hidden among withered wildflowers. But what no one imagines is that this moment of shame will be the spark of a transformation that will defy the entire community. A tormented mountain man, a past that still breathes, and an impossible choice between resignation and true love await her. Hello, my dear friend. This is Jasper Ashwood, your narrator of Mountain Tales. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. A big hug to you all, and I hope you enjoy the story. Colorado Territory, year 1875. The afternoon fell over dusty trails as oil lamps began lighting their golden glow in a settlement that breathed hardship and secrets. Inside the Murphy cabin, a parlor with patchwork quilts awaited afternoon visitors. Wilted wildflowers in mason jars seemed to reflect Cora's mood as she stood with hands clasped before her calico skirt, listening to her sister's laughter. Magnolia, in her Sunday dress of blue cotton, held high a sealed envelope with theatrical astonishment. Beth, younger but equally haughty, clapped and pretended surprise. "Oh, Cora, finally a secret admirer," she exclaimed with sharp laughter. The ladies present exchanged knowing glances, some with pity, others with barely disguised malice. Cora felt heat rise to her face. Her cheeks burned with shame as she lowered her gaze to the braided rug, her only refuge. Her cream cotton bodice suddenly felt tighter, as if wanting to suffocate the scream she dared not give. With serene movements, she took the handkerchief at her wrist and folded it carefully, while years of silences crowded inside her. The matriarch, seated in a high-backed rocking chair, observed with indecipherable expression. She wore a heavy grey dress with simple lace and an old cameo at her neck. She pretended not to see her older daughter's mockery, as if Cora's dignity were minor compared to maintaining appearances. Her calloused hand played with wooden rosary beads, marking the rhythm of her indifference. Cora inclined slightly, murmured an apology barely audible, and left the parlor. The echo of laughter remained behind, accompanied by the aroma of coffee with molasses that she no longer tasted. Her steps led her to the garden shed, a space of weathered wood where stored vegetables formed a secret refuge. There, among sacks and withered herbs, she finally let fall the tears she had contained for years. She knelt beside a crate of beans, rested her forehead in her hands, and closed her eyes. The shed seemed a sanctuary of solitude. Outside, sounds of horses reached barely as distant murmurs, as if the settlement were too far to reach her. Cora breathed deeply, trying to calm the trembling in her chest. In that corner she felt free from judging eyes. Meanwhile, in the parlor, Magnolia and Beth discussed plans for the next gathering. Names of bachelors passed from mouth to mouth like coins in a market. The matriarch announced they would attend a barn raising in Pine Ridge. "It'll restore our standing," she said coldly, without mentioning Cora. Cora heard the distant decision from the shed. She raised her head and dried her tears with her sleeve. The news reminded her that her life didn't entirely belong to her, and that in frontier society a woman could be invisible even in her own family. She stood with dignity, adjusted her skirt, and walked toward the door. Her hazel eyes, still moist, shone with new light, faint but firm, like embers refusing to be extinguished. Outside, the Colorado afternoon darkened. Cora was about to cross the threshold of a destiny that would change her life forever. But for now, she was the humiliated young woman gathering strength in silence, while withered herbs kept her secret. The barn raising in Pine Ridge unfolded under hanging lanterns and soft fiddle music. The timber barn was filled with ladies in finest calico and men in Sunday best with brass pocket watches. Cora had arrived wearing grey-blue gingham, simple but elegant, with embroidery she had done herself. Her hair was gathered in a low chignon with a carved bone comb. She wore no jewelry, except her grandmother's oval locket. While Magnolia and Beth glided through the barn like peacocks, Cora remained near quilted displays, absorbed in contemplating a needlework piece with intricate patterns. The melancholy scene, stitched with precision, reminded her of herself. From across the barn, Jeremiah Beaumont made his entrance. His imposing stature didn't go unnoticed. He dressed with absolute sobriety in black wool coat, grey vest, and black neckerchief with a pine sprig in his lapel. His steel blue eyes swept the barn with indifference until his gaze stopped. In the midst of golden bustle and artificial laughter, a different figure captured his attention. It wasn't just her stillness that intrigued him, but how she observed the needlework, as if something intimate played out in it. Without thinking, the mountain man approached. Cora didn't notice until he stopped nearby. She felt his presence like a warm shiver and turned slowly, finding herself facing a grave, noble face almost carved in granite. "An exquisite piece," he said in a deep voice. Strange to find someone observing it with such devotion. Cora took a moment to respond. "It's not the stitching I admire, but the expression. Melancholy, when it's true, never goes out of style." Jeremiah felt the phrase stick in memory. No one in that barn would have said such a thing. The silence between them became dense, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two souls who recognized each other. "Are you fond of needlework?" he asked. "Only of the details others don't notice," Cora replied, not daring to hold his gaze long, but her words didn't waver. From the distance, Magnolia tightened her lips, seeing the scene. Beth looked uneasily. "Is she talking to him?" she whispered. "Yes, with the mountain man himself," Magnolia responded with venom, unable to understand how someone like Cora could capture his attention. Cora prepared to withdraw with a slight inclination. "I thank you for your kindness, sir. It's no trouble. It's been the most sincere conversation of the evening," Jeremiah replied, seeking to protect her from others' judgment. "Would you allow me to accompany you a few steps?" Cora looked bewildered. Walking alongside a mountain man under so many gazes seemed dangerous, but something inside her, a weak spark extinguished for years, said yes. They walked bordering the barn, near the meadow area. Between half-open canvas flaps and moonlight, they talked of books, silence, and finding truth among forced applause. The mountain man, accustomed to empty conversations, found himself searching for words to prolong the moment. When the fiddle began a more animated waltz, Cora stopped. "I should return to my family." "I understand," Jeremiah nodded, "though if you permit me to say it, not everything that seems invisible is so." Cora made a slight curtsy and walked away. She returned to her mother without noticing the fixed gazes, some amazed, others enraged. From the barn's end, Jeremiah watched her disappear among shadows and lights, thinking for the first time in years that perhaps that evening hadn't been obligation, but beginning. The following morning dawned with thick fog. The Murphy cabin's windows dripped with moisture as the neighbor girl entered with hurried steps, a sealed envelope trembling in her fingers. "An urgent letter, ma'am, brought by a rider in buckskins." The matriarch took the letter, and upon reading the sender, alarm crossed her gaze. Jeremiah Beaumont. The missive requested to visit that afternoon to formalize a conversation initiated at the Pine Ridge gathering. "What's happening?" asked Magnolia. "The mountain man has requested to come this afternoon formally." The news struck like lightning. Magnolia jumped up, face illuminated with anticipated triumph. "Of course he wants to see me," she affirmed. "I knew it." "Don't say foolishness," replied Beth. "It was with me he talked by the corral last spring." Cora, seated by the window, remained silent. She had felt something different in the mountain man's gaze, but didn't allow herself to dream. The preparation was frantic. Parlors were dusted, cushions beaten, lanterns polished. The sisters dressed in their finest, Beth in emerald green, Magnolia in deep blue with silver lace. Cora, by her mother's indication, wore something simple, a pearl-colored dress with clean lines and only a satin ribbon at the waist. When the clock marked 5, a black wagon with brass fittings stopped outside. Jeremiah Beaumont descended with his usual composure, wearing a long dark wool coat and silver-grey vest. He was received in the parlor with coffee served, and the three sisters aligned like portraits ready to be judged. "Mrs." Murphy nodded with measured inclination, weighing each gesture. The mountain man responded with courtesy but without smiles. After a few minutes of trivial conversation, in which Magnolia strived to appear witty and Beth to seem charming, the mountain man asked with firm voice, "Would it be possible to take a walk through the garden with Miss Cora?" The room froze. Cora followed him to the kitchen garden, where vegetable rows slept under grey sky. They walked in silence, dried leaves crunching under boots. "I must confess my visit is not a whim," he said. "I wish to propose something unusual. Miss Sarah, my aunt, requires company at my homestead. She mentioned your name with affection. I desire that you accept to accompany her for some weeks. As companion? Cora asked quietly. Exactly. Miss Sarah seeks someone to share her days. I want to know you better. There was something in his eyes that burned. This isn't a common request, she said. Neither are you a common woman, he replied. I've lived surrounded by people who talk without saying anything. You're different. I want to know what lies behind that calm, that sadness in your eyes. Cora trembled inside. I don't know what to respond. Don't decide now, just consider it. I'll speak with your mother. If you accept, the high country can be a quiet place to breathe. When they returned, he requested audience with Mrs. Murphy. Later, Cora learned everything had been agreed upon. The wagon would leave in 2 days. Magnolia cried with rage. Beth broke her fan. Cora didn't sleep that night, watching fog close over the settlement. The wagon advanced along a narrow trail flanked by tall pines. Cora held a small poetry book, though she didn't open it. She wore a grey wool coat fitted at the waist, hair gathered in a sober chignon. The Murphy cabin had been left behind hours before. Upon arrival, the homestead stood imposing. Clear stone with timber columns and large windows. A tall woman with angular but kind features appeared. Miss Murphy, she said. I'm Miss Sarah Beaumont. Welcome to Pine Ridge Homestead. Miss Sarah, in black velvet with white hair in a firm chignon, radiated dignity. I'll show you to your quarters. Cora followed through paneled hallways with oil lamps. The walls held family portraits and mountain landscapes. What caught her attention were the clocks, one in each hallway marking different rhythms. Her room was spacious but austere. Linen curtains moved with breeze. A fireplace offered warmth. From the window, she saw the workshop in the distance, half hidden by mist. During first days, Cora moved with discretion. Miss Sarah received her each morning with coffee and walks through the crafts gallery. They spoke little, but each conversation left unexpected teaching. The parlors are for those who shout, Sarah told her one afternoon, but workshops and gardens are for those who listen. Cora began frequenting the workshop, finding silent comfort among wood shavings and soft fragrances. It was on one walk that she saw the mountain man standing at the clearing's edge, hands crossed behind his back, gaze fixed on the horizon. Cora remained motionless among berry bushes, as if the moment were a painting she shouldn't disturb. He slowly turned his head and their gazes met. No smile or courtesy gesture, but something was said in that silence. He continued his walk, and she returned to the workshop with heart beating intensely. In following days, encounters were subtle, always distant. In corridors, the vestibule, the garden under winter sky, they never exchanged more than light greetings, but in each gaze was tacit recognition of something invisible. Miss Sarah noticed it. My nephew observes those worth observing, she commented one afternoon without raising her gaze from her mending. He doesn't waste time on words, but when he keeps quiet, he says more than he believes. Cora didn't respond, only lowered her eyes to her sewing, though she hadn't passed the needle a single time. One evening during supper, Jeremiah joined them. It was an uncommon occasion, as he usually dined alone in his study. The conversation was light. Comments about a book on frontier medicine, a reference to Kentucky whiskey, and then a silence that prolonged when he directed his attention to Cora. You enjoy the gardens, Miss Murphy? Cora raised her gaze calmly. Very much. There's something in the silence of the growing things that isn't found in parlors. Jeremiah nodded slowly. Then, without breaking the solemnity of the moment, he added, My mother used to say that only one who knows how to care for something that doesn't speak can care for a soul. The comment had no evident recipient, but to Cora it seemed an offering, a piece of his inner world placed on the table, naked and sincere. That night, in her room, Cora lit a candle and wrote in her thoughts notebook. It wasn't a diary, it was rather a collection of phrases that helped her remember what she felt without knowing why. She wrote, The wind here doesn't push, it caresses. The house doesn't confine me, it listens. He doesn't speak, but there's something in his silence that touches me like a whisper. Upon closing the notebook, she heard in the distance the tolling of one of the hallway clocks. It marked midnight. Outside, the mist covered the fields like a veil, and the workshop slept under the moon. But inside her something began to awaken. In the house of wind, the invisible lady was no longer so invisible. Though no one said it aloud, she was beginning to be seen, and something in the air announced that this was just beginning. The rain fell with light insistence on the workshop windows, drawing oblique threads that ran down the glass like silent tears. It was a grey afternoon in midweek, the kind when time seems to stagnate in the murmur of clocks and the creaking of wood under the soft steps of the household. Cora had asked permission to explore the private study, a room apart from the main wing, whose key was given to her by Miss Sarah with a gesture of silent complicity. "There are books there that no one opens anymore," said the old woman with a faint voice. "Perhaps you'll get along well with their ghosts." The study was a world in itself. The walls covered with shelves of dark wood, the shelves filled with volumes of worn bindings, the thick curtains that barely let light pass, a writing desk covered with dust, and in the back a fireplace that still preserved the aroma of burned pine. Cora walked the narrow aisles with a mixture of reverence and amazement. There were titles on frontier life, treatises on mountain survival, books of distant travels, and compiled letters from authors she had only known by name. It was while passing her fingers over the cover of an old atlas that she noticed furniture that didn't seem to be part of the ensemble. A cedar cabinet built into the wall whose door was ajar. Curiosity, timid but firm, led her to look inside. There, covered by a yellowed linen cloth, rested an oil portrait. It wasn't large, but its golden frame, slightly worn, revealed that it had once occupied a place of honor. She removed the cloth delicately. What she saw left her breathless. It was a young woman with dark hair, gathered with care, almond eyes of grave expression, and lips outlined with a softness that spoke of repressed tenderness. She wore a navy blue dress with lace at the neckline, and a pearl choker encircled her neck with the same exactness with which a ribbon can hold a promise. The background of the portrait was a garden, and behind the central figure, almost hidden, the silhouette of a man with his back turned could be made out. Cora understood, without anyone telling her, that this was the mountain man's deceased wife. A stab of discomfort lodged in her chest. It wasn't jealousy or even comparison. It was someone else's pain that suddenly reached her, as if that portrait, set apart from the rest of the world, contained a story still throbbing. She looked at her with respect, didn't look away. She felt that woman was also watching her from the immobility of time. "I didn't think to find you here." The deep, serene voice took her by surprise. Cora turned slowly. Jeremiah was in the threshold without coat, with his linen shirt open at the neck and gloves in hand. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze didn't move from the portrait. Cora didn't excuse herself. She didn't pretend not to have seen it. "I was looking for books," she said frankly. "I didn't know this was here." He took a step toward the cabinet and fixed his eyes on the painting. For a moment, his silence was so eloquent it filled the entire room. "No one has entered this room for years," he said at last. "Not even me." Cora lowered her gaze. She didn't know if she should cover the portrait or leave it as it was. Jeremiah, without looking at her, extended his hand and closed the cabinet door softly. "Did you love her?" she asked in a low voice, surprised by her own boldness. He raised his eyebrows without anger, but with a shadow that immediately installed itself in his features. "It's a simple question, with a complicated answer." Cora didn't move. The creaking of wood under her feet was the only sound between them. "Sometimes one loves the idea of someone more than the person themselves," he said, almost like a thought aloud. "Or loves them with such need that you forget if that person could correspond to that need." Cora didn't respond. The silence on her lips was also a form of listening. "She was ill from the beginning," he continued, with a tone that permitted no consolation. "The doctors knew it. I learned later, but by then I had already made the decision to stay, to protect her, to be her rock. She never asked for love, but I offered it anyway, with the stubbornness of one who believes they can save someone just by being near." The confession wore him down word by word. There was in him a mixture of guilt and pride, of drowned tenderness and resentment toward his own youth. "She died in this house," he said without drama, surrounded by everything she didn't need and all those who couldn't help her. Cora slowly raised her gaze. "And were you able to say goodbye?" Jeremiah looked at her for the first time since he entered the room. His gaze was like an open wound. "No," he said. "I left that night, hours before. I couldn't bear to see her break apart. I preferred she remember me standing, though I was already falling apart inside." Silence returned to settle between them, but this time it was dense, cutting. Cora took a step toward him, not out of boldness, but out of compassion. She didn't extend her hand, didn't say another word, only remained there near, firm. He observed her with an intensity that burned, Then, as if something inside him rose again in self-defense, he murmured, "I hope you haven't come here with the hope of filling her place. No one can occupy a place that doesn't belong to them." Cora felt the phrase like a dry blow, but didn't retreat. "I didn't come to fill anything, sir," she responded with serenity. "I only came to be who I am. If that makes you uncomfortable, I can leave." Jeremiah pressed his lips. He seemed to debate between the impulse to protect his wall and the temptation to let it fall, but in the end, as so many times in his life, he chose silence as shield. He turned toward the door and before leaving said in a low voice, "I have no space for fragility in my world, Miss Murphy." And he left. Cora remained alone, standing before the closed cabinet. She didn't cry, didn't feel defeated. Instead, she breathed deeply and caressed the spine of a nearby book, as if the mute words could give her strength. She had entered not knowing what she was looking for and had left with a new certainty. Jeremiah Beaumont wasn't a cruel man, but a broken man. And in that break, there were cracks where light still entered. That night, while the house slept under the persistent rain, the mountain man didn't light candles or open books. He walked alone through the hallway, passed his fingers over the frame of a closed door, and stopped before the portrait he had been avoiding for years. Alone with his memory, he finally let himself look at it, and for the first time in years, felt fear of his own solitude. Not because it destroyed him, but because, in the presence of a woman like Cora, he no longer knew if he wanted to keep it. Spring timidly peeked out in the Colorado fields. The aspens bloomed slowly, and the perfume of wildflowers began to scent the corridors of the Beaumont homestead. Cora spent most of her days in the workshop, reorganizing tools, noting observations in a notebook she had begun to fill with care and dedication. Aunt Sarah watched her from the window, increasingly convinced that this young woman wasn't a passing visitor, but a breath of fresh air the homestead had needed for years. But while calm reigned in the Colorado high country, in the settlement, the community began to murmur. The mountain man's appearances at public events had reduced, and the official excuses convinced no one. The sharpest tongues, those hidden behind quilted bonnets and cups of cider, began to weave an alternative tale. An unknown young woman, without dowry or claim, sheltered under the roof of a widowed mountain man. A single imprudent letter sent by a neighbor girl seeking social advancement was enough for the Murphy sisters to learn of the situation. Magnolia was the first to explode. "They've installed her in the high country," she screamed, breaking a cup against the wooden floor. Her, the shadow of this family. Beth, with a mixture of shame and rage, tried to calm her, but without conviction. There must be some explanation. Perhaps it was Miss Sarah who requested her. "Don't be naive," interrupted Magnolia. "That girl always knew how to feign weakness to play the victim, and now she's stealing what belongs to me." Without waiting for their mother's authorization, Magnolia wrote an urgent letter to the Beaumont homestead, announcing her unexpected visit with the pretext of bringing family news. They left that same afternoon with Beth assumed in silence and nerves hidden behind her wide-brimmed bonnet. Cora, still unaware of the approaching storm, was in the study selecting some volumes about mountain flora when the man announced with a rigid expression, "The Murphy sisters have arrived, Miss Cora. They request to see you immediately." Cora's heart stopped for an instant. She knew this day could come, but didn't expect it to be so soon or so violent. When she entered the main parlor, she saw them standing like two statues, perfectly dressed, but with venom already dancing on their tongues. Miss Sarah, seated in her chair with brocade cushions, greeted them with the courtesy corresponding to a hostess, but with a cold gleam in her eyes. The mountain man wasn't at the homestead at that moment. Magnolia was direct. As soon as Cora crossed the threshold, her voice cut the air. "How convenient your trip turned out, dear sister. A mountain homestead, care, and a widowed mountain man at your mercy. You didn't do badly for being so quiet." Cora didn't respond. She didn't need to. Magnolia's tone spoke more about her than her victim. "Was it your idea or his? How did you manage it? With what lies?" continued Magnolia, increasingly haughty. "You told him you were different, that you sought nothing. You played the pure soul." "Enough," interrupted Miss Sarah with firm, measured voice. "I won't permit this type of language in my house." But Magnolia didn't retreat. Her rage was too fed by years of contempt for her sister, by the idea that someone like Cora could obtain something she had never achieved. "And you, ma'am? Are you blind, or have you also been deceived?" Cora raised her head. Her face had no tears, but a firmness she rarely showed. "I haven't deceived anyone. I came to this house because they offered it to me. I asked for nothing and don't have to justify myself to you." The silence that followed was thick. At that moment, the door opened. The mountain man entered without announcement, with his face darkened by the afternoon wind. He had heard enough from the hallway. "Murphy sisters," he said with coldness. "I'll thank you to leave my house before nightfall." Magnolia paled. "You're throwing us out." "I'm protecting the peace of a lady I respect," he responded without raising his voice. "And I won't permit scandal or envy to ruin the little that still makes sense in this place." Beth took her sister's arm with glassy eyes. Magnolia, without words for the first time, raised her chin and left with hard steps. Miss Sarah, with hands interlaced in her lap, didn't move or pronounce a single word. When the door closed again, silence became dense. The mountain man looked at Cora. He said nothing, neither did she, but something in the air had broken, something that, although he had tried to protect, had already wounded her dignity. Cora spent the night sleepless. She knew she had been defended, that she hadn't been allowed to be humiliated, and yet she felt the weight of every word thrown like darts. She looked at herself in the mirror of her room, not as she saw herself the day of her arrival, but as she was now. A woman who was beginning to know her worth but also exposed. At dawn she rose in silence, put her books in a small satchel, carefully folded her dresses, and wrote a note she left on the table. She didn't wake anyone, didn't ask for farewells. The wagon that left that morning wasn't the mountain man's but a hired one. The driver didn't ask where she was going, only obeyed. The Beaumont homestead remained behind in the mist, with its windows fogged by humidity and the perfume of wildflowers still floating in the air. In the hallway, Miss Sarah found the note shortly after breakfast. She read it in silence and closed her eyes with regret. Cora wasn't leaving out of cowardice. She was leaving because she couldn't bear being pointed at for something she had never sought, because she needed to recover her own name before society reduced it to a malicious whisper. And in her chest, between sadness and calm, something beat strongly. The certainty that what was lived wasn't erased, but neither was it begged for. If someone looked for her, let it be because they had recognized her, not because they had lost her. The settlement received her with an opaque sky and thick air that seemed to drag murmurs. The town, vast and merciless, hadn't changed in her absence. The dusty avenues continued resonating under wagon wheels, and street vendors still filled the corners of the southern district with shouts. But Cora was no longer the same. She had returned without announcing herself, without luxury baggage or servants to accompany her. She only carried a modest satchel, some books, and the quiet determination to rebuild herself far from scandal. She settled in a small boarding house on the outskirts, attended by a kind widow who asked no questions. With the help of a recommendation letter written by Miss Sarah, she obtained in a few days a position as music teacher at the residence of the Hendersons, an established family that valued discretion as much as classical formation. In that quiet, elegant house, Cora taught piano to a girl with large eyes and clumsy fingers. Each morning she wore her grey skirt and linen blouse, gathered her hair carefully, and presented herself punctually in the music parlour. She played with patience the most elementary scales, corrected the student's posture with tenderness, and upon leaving, disappeared among the settlement fog like another figure among the crowd. She was invisible again, but now by choice. She didn't speak of the high country, didn't mention the Murphys, much less the name that continued occupying her thoughts in the longest nights. She kept inside a knot she didn't want to untie, not out of pride, but out of dignity. One April morning, while reviewing sheet music by the piano, she heard the doorbell. She didn't look up, accustomed to the routine of servants and social visits. But when the parlour door opened, and the figure that appeared was Jeremiah Beaumont, Cora felt the world stop for an instant. He wore black as always, but without coat or rifle. His hair was slightly dishevelled by wind, and his gloves hung in his left hand. There was in his face a weariness that had nothing to do with travel, but with something deeper, more urgent. "I need to speak with you," he said with firm voice, without unnecessary courtesy. Cora stood up. The girl looked at her surprised, and left with the main teacher without asking questions. The parlour remained in silence. The wall clock marked time with a tick-tock that seemed exaggerated, uncomfortable. "You can't present yourself like this," murmured Cora, crossing her hands before her. "This isn't a place for—" "For what?" he interrupted. For a man to seek the only woman who has meant something in years. Cora swallowed, didn't move. So you left without warning, he said, approaching a step. Left a note like one leaves a forgotten handkerchief. Was that all I meant to you? I didn't leave because of you, she responded without raising her voice. I left for me. Jeremiah lowered his gaze, ran his fingers over the back of the nearest chair, then raised his gaze straight to her eyes. I know I was unfair. I know I let the ghosts dominate me, but I'm not going to lose you out of pride. Cora looked at him without blinking. The pain was still there, hidden in the depths of her gaze, but it no longer dominated her gestures. I didn't come to the settlement to hide. I came to work, to build something of my own. That's not what I desire for you, he said with contained voice. And that's exactly what prevents me from saying yes, replied Cora, with a calm that hurt more than any scream. The mountain man approached another step. They were less than a yard apart. He didn't touch her. He didn't try to take her hand, only spoke. Cora Murphy, I want you to be my wife. The phrase remained floating in the air like an echo that doesn't dare fall. Cora breathed deeply. Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. It wasn't emotion. It was internal struggle. Why? She asked in a whisper. Because there's not a single corner in that homestead that doesn't remind me of you. Because you returned voice to my silences. Because since you left, everything returned to grey. Cora lowered her gaze. And won't it be that you're only seeking to fill a void, that you need to replace silence for something more comfortable? No, he said with firmness. I don't want to replace anything. I want to start anew with you. She looked at him, and though her heart trembled, her voice didn't waver. You don't see me as equal. You protect me. You admire me, but you still look at me from a pedestal or from a wound. I don't want to be the second attempt at happiness for a man who hasn't yet made peace with his past. The mountain man closed his eyes an instant, as if each word struck him. Then, you reject me? Yes, she said with softness. Not because I don't care for you, but because I care for myself enough not to accept you like this. Jeremiah didn't insist, didn't beg, only nodded with a slight inclination of his head. He turned with the measured steps of a defeated soldier and left without saying another word. Cora remained alone. The clock continued marking its indifferent rhythm. Outside, a cart passed, leaving wet marks on the cobblestones. She approached the piano and rested her fingers on the keys without playing them. Closings without music. That's what hurt most. That night, upon returning to her boarding house, she lit a candle and opened her notebook. She didn't write anything, only let silence keep her company. For the first time she felt strong and alone, as if both things couldn't be separated. And in the depths of her soul, between renunciation and certainty, she knew she had done the right thing, though the price was her heart. The Colorado sky dawned covered by a thick blanket of clouds. The air, humid and silent, seemed to have suspended the usual bustle of the settlement. In the small room Cora rented on the outskirts, the greyish light of morning entered timidly through the fogged window. Seated by her work table, she tuned with patience a children's piece she had copied by hand for her student. Each note seemed a defense, a way to protect herself from the emptiness that had settled since that definitive encounter in the Henderson parlor. Her days were methodical, ordered, silent. She taught in the mornings, sewed or read in the afternoons, and wrote in her notebook at nightfall. On paper, emotions hurt less, and nevertheless, no matter how much she tried to feign normalcy, there was an absence that beat like a second shadow. It wasn't just that of a man, but of all that could have been. That morning, while reviewing a melody with the piano closed, the boarding house bell rang with an insistence that wasn't proper for the hour. Mrs. Cartwright, owner of the place, climbed the stairs with hurried step and knocked softly at her door. Miss Murphy, you have a visitor. Cora frowned. She expected no one. Upon going down to the small receiving parlor, she stopped seeing Miss Sarah seated wrapped in a travel cloak of dark violet, with gloves still on, and a serene but decided expression. Miss Sarah? Asked Cora, surprised. Good afternoon, dear, responded the old woman with a slight smile. Before you alarm yourself, I don't come in anyone's name, I come for myself. Cora, still bewildered, invited her to sit and asked for coffee from the landlady, who showed herself more than willing to serve such a distinguished lady. When they were alone, Miss Sarah observed her attentively as if seeking to recognize in her face the traces of recent weeks. I'll ask you a question, she said with sweetness. Are you happy here? Cora didn't respond immediately. She looked around at the humble furniture, at the timid fire in the fireplace, at the coffee pot that steamed without ceremony. "I'm at peace," she said at last, "which isn't the same, but resembles it." Miss Sarah nodded, lowering her gaze to her own gloved and firm hands. She took from her bag a closed envelope with an unsealed crest. She held it in her fingers a few seconds before offering it. "I don't want to force you to anything, Cora, but this was written for you and not sent out of fear." Cora took the envelope carefully without opening it yet. Her pulse accelerated just enough to betray the tremor. The red wax was intact, without shield, as if it were a confession outside protocol. "It's from him." Miss Sarah didn't respond with words, only affirmed with her gaze. "I found it on his writing desk. It had no date or address, only your name. I know what it means, and I also know what it can unleash. But I didn't come to beg. I came to tell you something he perhaps will never dare say." Cora observed her attentively without interrupting. Since his wife's death, Jeremiah closed himself to the world. Years passed without him allowing anyone to enter his thoughts. The women who surrounded him were no more than decorative figures. There was never interest, never a glance until you appeared. The emotion in the old woman's voice was contained, but true. "I saw him change slowly, with fear. You brought him out of a lethargy he didn't even recognize. You showed him he could still feel without losing control. But when a man has lived so long defended by his own coldness, love can seem a threat." Cora lowered her gaze to the letter, still closed in her hands. The envelope weighed more than paper, weighed like a decision. "Don't expect anything from me," she said with honesty. "I still don't know if I have anything to offer him. Everything was too violent, and it still hurts." "I don't ask you to forgive him," whispered Miss Sarah. "I ask you to listen to what his silence couldn't say." The old woman stood with dignity. Before leaving, she approached and took Cora's hand with a light, almost maternal gesture. Sometimes true love isn't said at the right moment. It's written and kept for fear of breaking us. Cora accompanied her to the door. She promised nothing, only inclined her head with gratitude, and when she was alone remained standing before the window with the letter in hand, not yet daring to open it. The afternoon light began to fall. The distant murmur of wagons was the only sound accompanying her. She sat before the writing desk, lit the oil lamp, and after an instant of silence broke the wax carefully. The handwriting was firm, but there was something of urgency in the stroke. The first words made her hold her breath. "Cora, I have no certainty these lines will reach your hands. Perhaps I'll never send them, but if someday you read them, I desire you to know something neither my pride nor my cowardice could tell you aloud. I saw you arrive at my house like one entering devastated land and without noise begins to sow. I didn't understand it then, but now I know you began returning life to a heart that no longer believed it deserved tenderness. You were light, you were calm, you were truth in a world where everything was echo, and still when I most needed to protect you, I let my past speak for me. I was unfair, I was cold, not because I didn't feel, but because I felt too much, and it terrified me." The words began to dissolve before Cora's eyes. Her lips trembled, her heart beat her chest forcefully. She continued reading with a solitary tear sliding down her cheek. "I don't want you to return out of compassion. I don't want you to return because I ask it. I only desire you to know that when I close my eyes, I don't see the woman I tried to drive away. I see the one who taught me it was still possible to live with an open chest. If you decide to stay away, I'll understand. But if you ever think of me, do so knowing I was yours even in my silence. Jeremiah." Cora let the letter fall on the table and brought both hands to her face. She didn't cry with desperation, but with a deep, contained pain of those that don't seek consolation, but understanding. Everything she had believed, pride, distance, superiority, was actually a fierce fear of losing her, of loving her. And now, with that letter between her fingers, she began to understand that sometimes love doesn't arrive wrapped in perfect gestures, but wounded, clumsy, and late. But when it's true, though it's not said in time, it can still be heard. The Colorado sky dawned covered by a thick veil of ashen clouds, as if it sensed the turbulence dwelling in Cora's chest. The settlement seemed to hold its breath, suspended between air humidity and expectant silence that not even the usual bustle of the streets managed to break. Miss Sarah insisted on going out for a walk, claiming that the confinement of recent days had awakened old joint pains. Cora, still moved by the letter the lady had given her, agreed with a slight nod, more out of gratitude than conviction. Both took a closed wagon to the vicinity of the settlement park, sheltered from cold by wool cloaks and wide-brimmed hats that partially hid their faces. The park, still wet from morning rains, exhaled the penetrating aroma of damp earth and wet leaves. The bare branches of the cottonwoods extended toward the sky like imploring fingers, and the small pond, still and grey, seemed an opaque mirror of contained emotions. They walked in silence for a long stretch, bordering the stone paths. Suddenly, Miss Sarah stopped, gently squeezed Cora's arm and whispered with measured voice, "I think you should continue alone now." Cora looked at her confused. "Alone?" The old woman held her gaze with tenderness. "Just around that bend. He's there. He hasn't seen you." Cora's heart beat with excessive force. Her fingers tightened on the wool muff while her mind resisted believing what her ears had heard. But her feet, guided by something deeper than reason, began to move. The path opened to a small clearing where a wooden gazebo stood among the shadows of the oaks. There, like a figure torn from a distant memory, was he. The mountain man, Jeremiah, wore a dark coat buttoned to the neck, with hair slightly dampened by persistent drizzle. He was motionless, with his back turned, hands interlaced behind his back, contemplating an invisible point beyond the trees. The same place where, weeks before, he had first noticed that young woman with absent gaze leafing through an herb catalogue. Cora stopped. The air seemed to have become denser. For some moments she doubted. The recent past rose like an invisible barrier. The humiliations, the rejected proposal, the unsent letter. But the memory of his words captured in trembling ink gave her strength. She advanced. Her steps on the damp ground barely made sound. She approached without announcing herself, until the distance between both was intimate enough that a sigh would suffice for him to hear it. Jeremiah turned slowly as if he had felt a presence before seeing her. His eyes, clear and tired, found her. For an instant, his face remained unalterable, as if his mind couldn't accept the image before him. Then, the gleam of astonishment lit his expression, followed by a tide of emotions he didn't try to hide. Cora. His voice was barely a murmur, a mixture of incredulity and relief. She didn't respond immediately. The wind stirred the folds of her beige coat and displaced some locks of her hair damp from drizzle. Her countenance was serene, but her eyes, deep and fixed, questioned him without need for words. "I didn't expect," he began hesitant. "Not after how we ended." Cora breathed deeply. The frozen air burned her chest, but she didn't divert her gaze. "I didn't come to claim anything from you." Jeremiah took a step toward her, then another, as if each movement cost him breaking years of containment. "You don't have to say anything," he said with grave voice. "I've understood I can't demand love or forgiveness from you, but I couldn't remain without saying it. Not again. When you left, something in this settlement stopped breathing. I stopped breathing." She felt her eyelids moisten, but kept them firm. Jeremiah continued, his voice increasingly low, more pained. "The letter was real. Every word, but I didn't know how to send it. I was a coward. I shielded myself in my claim, in my chosen solitude, and didn't see that you were the only one who could make this withered life bloom." Cora swallowed, feeling a knot in her throat. "Why did you propose marriage without telling me this?" The mountain man lowered his gaze, humiliated. "Because I feared if I showed my weakness you wouldn't take me seriously. I thought if I showed myself strong you'd accept me, but with you it was always different. You were always capable of seeing beyond." A silence charged with emotions settled between both. The rain continued falling soft and constant, as if the scene needed to be completely washed of old errors. Cora took a step toward him, then another. When she was close enough, she raised a hand and placed it delicately on the mountain man's chest. She felt his heart beating fast, same as hers. "And now?" she asked. "What do you see in me?" Jeremiah raised his gaze, and for the first time in years, his eyes were disarmed, vulnerable. "I see the woman I love not because she's perfect, but because she's real. Because your goodness doesn't need to be proclaimed, and your strength doesn't make noise. Because you saved me without knowing it." Cora smiled barely, a fragile gesture humid from drizzle and unshed tears. Then, without words, she raised her other hand and brought it to his face. She touched him barely, as if not wanting to break the spell, and in that soft, firm gesture was everything she couldn't say before. It was the silent answer to a never-sent letter. It was a yes that needed no words. Jeremiah inclined his face, closing his eyes, and rested his forehead against hers. They remained thus under the gazebo, under the rain, with no more witnesses than the trees and grey sky. The past couldn't be changed, wounds didn't disappear, but in that instant, between the touch of their foreheads and the tremor of their breathing, a new time opened. A time where there would be no letters without addressee, a time where finally they would choose each other without fear. Spring announced itself in Colorado fields with a gentle tremor of new life. The air, still fresh, carried the faint perfume of mountain laurels and the promise of sprouting on every bare branch. The Beaumont homestead, accustomed to the contained silence of its inhabitants, began to change skin, as if a different energy, warmer, more human, had infiltrated between its stone walls. Cora observed the workshop from the hallway. She wore a simple ivory muslin dress with no more adornment than a pale ribbon at the waist and an antique brooch lent by Miss Sarah. Her hair, gathered in a low chignon, left her neck exposed, barely touched by strands that freed themselves to the wind's whim. Her silhouette, standing by the window, seemed to form part of the landscape, but her eyes, fixed on the workshop's interior, betrayed a deep tremor that wasn't born from climate. Inside, a group of craftsmen carefully removed the dry tools that had been forgotten during the long winter. Some benches had been replaced by new equipment, wood lathes, metal forges, leatherworking tools. The restoration didn't obey only the mountain man's aesthetic desire, but an interior necessity. It was a symbolic reconstruction, a silent repair. That workshop that had witnessed past solitudes would now witness a rebirth. Cora moved from the glass upon hearing steps behind her. It was Miss Sarah, wrapped in a dark blue velvet cloak. Her eyes, lit by contained emotion, settled on her future niece with tenderness. "They're all in the dining room," she said with quiet voice. Jeremiah didn't want an ostentatious celebration as expected, only the necessary ones, only those who matter. Cora nodded. She needed no jewelry, orchestra, or parlor full of strangers feigning joy. That night intimacy was the greatest luxury. In the dining room, the long table had been carefully reduced to house only 7 people. Besides Miss Sarah, a pair of the mountain man's close friends, men of tempered conversation and faces marked by years, completed the group. The atmosphere was welcoming, without pretensions. The dinnerware was antique pewter decorated with mountain flowers. The tall candles projected warm light on the wooden walls, softening the furniture's contours. Jeremiah stood when Cora entered. He wore a black coat with satin lapels and a perfectly starched linen shirt. His white neckerchief was knotted with the same precision marking each of his gestures, but his eyes, upon seeing her, softened with a light no one had managed to draw from him in years. She advanced toward him with firm step. Upon reaching his side, he offered his arm with measured reverence. No need to announce the dinner's purpose. Everyone knew, everyone celebrated in silence. During the evening, there were no exaggerated toasts or high-sounding words, only complicit gazes, kind murmurs, and a peace that felt as solid as the walls surrounding them. Cora spoke little, but her eyes laughed. Jeremiah looked at her like one who has found anchor in the midst of storm. Upon finishing dinner, Miss Sarah asked permission to retire before the others. She carried in her hands a sealed envelope, tied with an antique silk ribbon. She left it in Cora's hand with a subtle smile and a squeeze of fingers. "Read it when you're ready," she whispered. Hours later, in the solitude of her chamber, Cora untied the ribbon with trembling hands. The letter written in Miss Sarah's measured handwriting wasn't extensive, but each word carried the gravity of a long-matured confession. "My dear Cora, throughout my life I've seen many women parade through Colorado settlements. Beautiful, educated, ambitious, docile, brilliant, but few, very few have left in me the mark you've left in such short time. You're not the loudest or most admired, but there's a force in your silence that bends even the most ancient arrogance. You didn't need to raise your voice to change an entire house's course, or declare yourself brave to hold the gaze of those who despised you. I saw you arrive like a shadow, accustomed to the world ignoring you. And now I see you firm in the place where only authentic women manage to be, in the heart of a man who had renounced love. Jeremiah isn't easy to love. His wounds don't heal with smiles, but you didn't try to cure him. You were only there with your clean hands and intact dignity. And that, dear girl, was his salvation. I give you this letter as testimony to what I witnessed, because someday when you doubt yourself again, I want you to remember it was you who transformed a ruined homestead into a home and a broken man into a husband." With respect and eternal admiration, Miss Sarah Beaumont. Cora left the letter on the dressing table and remained seated by the window, watching how the moon's reflection bathed the workshop's restored glass. In the distance, the garden lights twinkled like fulfilled promises. In her chest, a deep emotion, half gratitude, half vertigo, made her close her eyes. She was no longer the shadow who feared her sister's gaze. She was no longer the young woman crying in a corner, while others' laughter filled parlors. Now she was a loved woman, chosen not for convenience, but for sincere recognition of her worth. The workshop bloomed anew, and with it, her life. On one of the garden benches, Jeremiah waited for her, and she, for the first time, wasn't afraid to walk toward the light. Time, with its implacable pace, had left its mark on faces, gardens, and memories, but hadn't managed to wither what once bloomed with truth. 12 years after that intimate evening, where an engagement was announced without fanfare, the Beaumont homestead still stood, though warmer, more alive, more home. In the main hallway, the ancient portraits had been slightly displaced to give place to new images. An oil painting of soft tones showed Cora in a blue muslin dress seated among mountain laurels, with a brown-haired girl asleep in her lap. To one side, in another frame, Jeremiah could be seen standing next to a boy with inquisitive gaze, both before the workshop in full bloom. Visitors arriving in spring were received by the murmur of springs, the lavender aroma, and the echo of a story that, according to the servants, had changed the house's soul. Cora, now with slightly over 40 years, preserved the same serenity in her gaze, though she had acquired new security. Her steps were firm, her words precise. No one called her the Murphy shadow anymore. Now she was the lady of the Beaumont homestead, mother of 2 children, Catherine and Edmund, wife of a man who with years had learned to smile without fear and embrace without reserves. Jeremiah, though grey had begun to sprinkle his temples, maintained his erect stature and firm voice, but it was in his way of looking at Cora where time's passage became most evident. He looked at her with the tenderness of one who knows they've been saved. There were no longer walls between them or reserves, only the shared silence of 2 souls who had resisted together, winters and storms. The workshop, that symbol of rebirth, had become family refuge. There, Catherine read novels aloud, imagining distant worlds. Edmund planted seeds with impatient hands, dreaming of botanical inventions, and Cora, from an iron bench, observed in silence with full heart. Miss Sarah, though she no longer walked with the same agility, continued being the great matriarch. She had chosen to remain at the Colorado homestead and never return to the settlement. She said with wise smile that true nobility doesn't live in social dances, but in decisions made when no one applauds. But not all destinies were sweet. Magnolia, Cora's older sister, had finally married a man of fortune, but without affection. The life that mattered so much to her to be admired ended being a succession of broken appearances. She spent seasons at southern spas, writing letters no one answered. The youth she used as coin ran out too soon. Beth, on the other hand, disappeared from social circles after an economic scandal where her husband lost his fortune. She lived with a distant aunt, and in her eyes, they said, there was something of repentance, though she never expressed it in words. Cora held no rancor. She had learned that true triumph wasn't revenge, but living with fullness. Society also had begun to change. Women of her generation were no longer seen uniquely for their capacity to make good marriages. The gatherings spoke of literature, education, even politics. Young women arriving at the high country sought advice from Cora, not only for her position, but for her history. One April afternoon, while sun tinged the sky with golden tones, Cora walked to the workshop alone. She carried in her hands a small wooden box. Inside she kept letters, newspaper clippings, a dried flower, and an antique brooch, the same she wore that night when everything changed. She sat on her favorite bench and began writing a letter unhurriedly. Dear Catherine, perhaps one day you'll read this and wonder how it all began. It wasn't with a dance or jewels or grandiose promises. It began in pain, in humiliation, in shadow. But it also began with an act of silent bravery, not letting others decide who I was. Love wasn't a prize, my daughter. It was a choice repeated each day, even when it hurt, even when the past tried to slip through the cracks. I chose to stay, and he chose to let himself be reached. That's what lasting love is about. You who were born among flowers Always remember the strongest roots are forged in darkness, and a woman doesn't need to be celebrated to be extraordinary. With eternal love, your mother. Cora kept the letter, closed the box, and buried it among the roots of a young pine tree, the same Edmund had planted the previous summer. The sun bid farewell to the sky when Jeremiah appeared in silence. He said nothing, only offered his hand. She took it without asking. They walked together back to the house, surrounded by flowers, memories, and a love that 12 years later had done nothing but flourish. Sometimes life seems determined to make us believe our worth depends on others' eyes, but Cora showed us the opposite. She taught us that silent dignity, repressed tenderness, and hope that doesn't die can transform even the most hardened heart. She didn't shout to be heard. She bloomed in silence, and that blooming changed her destiny, and that of those around her. This story reminds us that true love doesn't seek adornments or perfection, but truth. That it doesn't matter how many times others despise you if you know your worth, because there's always a winter that ends, and a workshop that blooms again. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments which part touched your heart most. And if you reached here, write the word renewal. That way we'll know you share this emotion with us to the last breath. Don't forget to see other similar narratives I leave in the final cards. Perhaps the next will also be unforgettable for you. Thank you for being here, and never forget, the strongest love is that which needs no witnesses, only truth.